The night sky above the Oregon wilderness erupted in a symphony of destruction. Quantum-shifted plasma engines tore through the atmosphere, leaving a trail of superheated debris that illuminated the dense forest like a terrible, transient sun. Radio frequencies crackled with incomprehensible alien transmissions, a cacophony of sound that would have sent any rational species into a panic. Dr. Maya Rodriguez wasn't most people. As lead xenobiological first responder for the Global Emergent Species Interaction Protocol, GESIP, she had spent her entire career preparing for the impossible. Her team's mobile research station was already in motion, cutting through the forest with a precision that suggested they were chasing something as mundane as a lost hiker rather than humanity's first confirmed extraterrestrial crash. Thermal signatures are off the charts, her AI assistant, Araya, reported. The holographic display flickered with impossible data, heat signatures that defied known physics, radiation patterns that twisted conventional understanding, molecular structures that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Maya's hand brushed against the custom-designed protective gear. It wasn't military armor or a hazmat suit, but a carefully engineered ensemble that spoke to her philosophy. Approach with understanding, not fear. Embedded with advanced biosensors, adaptive micro-cooling systems, and a neural link communication array, the suit was as much a scientific instrument as a protective layer. The Krexel scout ship, though ship was a generous term, looked like something that had been simultaneously crushed and exploded. Its crystalline hull fragments reflected moonlight in impossible geometric patterns, creating an almost beautiful mosaic of destruction. Traditional crash protocols would dictate containment, military intervention, quarantine. Maya's team did something entirely different. Prepare medical stabilization protocols, she commanded, and get me a thermal blanket. Something soft. They're likely in shock. Her second in command, Dr. Raj Patel, raised an eyebrow. We don't know if they breathe oxygen, or if physical contact is even safe. We know they're alive. Maya responded, her voice cutting through the tension. And being alive means being vulnerable. The first Krexel survivor emerged like a nightmare given flesh. Razor-sharp biometallic appendages, a body that seemed to shift between solid and liquid states, eyes that were less organic orbs, and more complex mathematical equations given light. Any rational species would have opened fire, would have seen only a threat. Maya saw a being in pain. Her approach was glacially slow, telegraphing every movement. One hand held a thermal blanket, the other a medical scanner that was less a weapon and more a bridge of understanding. The Krexel creature tensed, a movement that would have triggered automated defense systems on most first contact protocols. She spoke, not in English, not in any human language, but in a carefully modulated tone that universal communication research had proven transcended linguistic barriers, a sound of comfort, of safety. The Krexel's multiple sensory clusters, things that were simultaneously eyes, ears, and something entirely alien, focused on her with an intensity that would have broken lesser individuals. Maya didn't break. She extended the thermal blanket. The ship's emergency recording system would later capture a moment that would become legendary, not a military triumph, not a scientific breakthrough, but a simple, almost tender act of compassion that would challenge everything the galaxy understood about first contact. A thermal blanket, extended to a being that could have obliterated her with a mere thought. The Krexel survivors would later testify that this was the moment they understood humans were not like any species they had ever encountered, not because of technological superiority, not because of martial prowess, but because, in humanity's first moment of extraterrestrial contact, the primary response was not weapons or walls. It was a blanket, and a voice that said, without words, "You are hurt. You are safe." The GESIP research facility looked nothing like a military installation or a traditional scientific laboratory. Nestled in the heart of the Cascade Mountains, it was a living ecosystem of scientific curiosity and interspecies understanding. Multiple biomes flowed into one another, controlled environments that could simulate everything from deep-sea pressures to the methane atmospheres of gas giants. Dr. Maya Rodriguez watched through multispectral observation windows as the Crexel survivors began their adaptation process. They weren't prisoners. They weren't test subjects. They were guests, a concept that would baffle most galactic civilizations. The first challenge was communication. Traditional translation technologies failed spectacularly. The Crexel communication system was a complex quantum entanglement of biological electromagnetic pulses that human computers initially interpreted as random noise. Dr. Raj Patel's breakthrough came from an unexpected source: marine biology. They're communicating like a hyper-advanced version of cephalopod communication, Raj explained, pulling up holographic displays that transformed electromagnetic pulses into intricate, shifting color patterns. It's not just language, it's a complete sensory experience. The Crexel, meanwhile, were experiencing their own revelations. Their initial military conditioning, millennia of hierarchical structure and conflict-based interaction, began to unravel in the most unexpected ways. Zixara, the senior Crexel survivor, found herself inexplicably drawn to the facility's rehabilitation wing. Humans were treating injured local wildlife with the same intense focus they applied to the alien survivors. A team worked meticulously to save a young wolf with a complex leg injury, using a combination of advanced prosthetics and regenerative therapy. Why? Zixara's communication burst finally translated. Why invest resources in a single injured predator? Dr. Elena Martinez, the wildlife rehabilitation specialist, didn't miss a beat. Because every life has value, every individual matters. The concept was so alien to Crexel philosophy that it took days for the translation systems to properly process the response. In Crexel society, individual organisms were replaceable units. Efficiency was the ultimate virtue. Emotional attachment was a critical weakness. Humans turned that entire paradigm inside out. The facility's most remarkable feature was its adaptive environment. Walls could shift molecular composition. Atmospheric conditions could change in milliseconds. It was designed not to contain, but to understand. Each Crexel survivor was given unprecedented freedom, with one primary directive: explore, interact, learn. Dr. Rodriguez's approach was revolutionary. Where other species saw potential threats, she saw potential connections. The Crexel survivors were provided with neural link education interfaces that didn't just teach human language and culture. They created immersive experiences that allowed deep empathetic understanding. Zixara's first breakthrough came during a simulated environmental challenge. The test was designed to measure stress responses, adaptability, cooperative skills. What should have been a military-style assessment became something entirely different. When a simulated environmental catastrophe was introduced, a massive ecosystem collapse scenario, the Crexel didn't default to survival protocols. They began to collaborate, not just with each other, but with the human researchers. They started solving the challenge as a unified team, sharing information, supporting each other's weaknesses. Dr. Rodriguez watched the data streams with quiet excitement. This wasn't just about understanding an alien species. This was about demonstrating a fundamental truth. Connection was more powerful than conflict. The Crexel were beginning to understand that strength wasn't about individual superiority. It was about collective resilience. By the end of the first month, something unprecedented happened. The Crexel survivors began requesting additional information about human social structures. They wanted to understand friendship, cooperation, the complex emotional landscapes that humans navigated so effortlessly. Their military commanders would have been horrified. But here, in this mountain sanctuary, something beautiful was emerging. Not just first contact, not just cultural exchange, a genuine bridge between two completely different ways of understanding existence. The Global Neurological Diversity Research Center was not a typical scientific facility. Located in a converted aerospace complex outside Buenos Aires, it represented the bleeding edge of human understanding of consciousness, adaptation, and interspecies cognition. Dr. Arya Nakamura stood before a holographic display that would have looked like abstract art to most observers. Quantum-entangled neural maps danced with impossible complexity, representing the cognitive patterns of the Krexel survivors alongside human baseline measurements. What she was seeing challenged every fundamental assumption about intelligence, consciousness, and adaptation. "It's not just different," she muttered to her research partner, Dr. Marcus Okoye. "It's fundamentally revolutionary." The Krexel neural architecture was a living fractal, a cognitive system that didn't just process information but transformed it. Where human brains created linear pathways, Krexel consciousness existed as a multi-dimensional quantum network. Each thought was simultaneously a memory, a predictive model, and a potential future state. The research team's approach was equally unconventional. Instead of attempting to categorize or contain, they sought to understand. Collaborative neural interfaces allowed for unprecedented levels of cross-species communication. It wasn't translation in the traditional sense. It was a form of empathetic resonance that defied existing scientific paradigms. Zixera, the Krexel survivor who had become central to the research, underwent a series of tests that would have been considered invasive or unethical by most galactic standards. But here, in this facility, it was a mutual exploration. The Krexel wasn't a subject. They were a partner in unraveling the mysteries of consciousness. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. During a routine cognitive mapping session, Dr. Nakamura noticed something extraordinary. The Krexel neural network began to develop adaptive pathways that mimicked human emotional processing, not through mechanical mimicry, but through a genuine process of neural transformation. "They're learning empathy," Marcus observed, his voice a mixture of scientific excitement and profound wonder. Not just understanding it, actually developing new neural pathways to experience it. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about two species understanding each other. This was evidence of a fundamental capacity for cognitive evolution that transcended biological limitations. The facility's most advanced experiment involved a complex series of collaborative problem-solving scenarios. Traditional tests would measure individual performance, competitive metrics, survival strategies. This was different. The tests were designed to reward collective thinking, emotional intelligence, and adaptive cooperation. Krexel survivors worked alongside human researchers, their neural interfaces creating a living, breathing network of shared consciousness. They weren't just solving problems, they were reimagining the very concept of problem-solving. One particular test involved a simulated first contact scenario with a completely unknown intelligent species. Most galactic civilizations would approach such a scenario with defensive protocols, weapon systems primed, communication channels prepared for potential conflict. The human Krexel team approached it as an opportunity for connection. Their solution was so radical that it took the research team days to fully comprehend its implications. Instead of defensive strategies or diplomatic protocols, they proposed a comprehensive approach based on mutual curiosity, emotional transparency, and a fundamental assumption of potential friendship. Dr. Nakamura's final report was a masterpiece of scientific understatement. Cognitive adaptation is not just possible. It is the natural state of intelligent life when barriers of fear are removed. The Krexel survivors were changing, but so were the humans. The neural interfaces worked both ways, a living demonstration that true understanding was a two-way process of transformation. Zixera, once a military operative from a civilization built on hierarchical conflict, now spoke with a complexity of emotion that would have been impossible mere months ago. "We are becoming," they communicated, a phrase that defied simple translation but captured something profound about the nature of consciousness, of growth, of connection. The research center had become more than a scientific facility. It was a living laboratory of possibility, a place where the boundaries between species blurred, where intelligence revealed itself as something far more fluid, far more beautiful than anyone had ever imagined. In the heart of this facility, something extraordinary was happening. Two species were not just learning to communicate. They were learning to become something entirely new. The United Nations Interstellar Diplomatic Complex wasn't a building so much as it was a living, breathing ecosystem of potential communication. Constructed on a massive orbital platform that defied traditional architectural principles, it existed at the intersection of human innovation and galactic diplomacy. Ambassador Elena Reyes stood at the central atrium, watching as delegations from across known space gathered for what would become the most unprecedented diplomatic event in galactic history. The Krexel survivors, no longer prisoners or research subjects, but recognized representatives, moved through the space with a fluidity that spoke to their profound transformation. This was more than a diplomatic conference. It was a crucible of possibility. The Galactic Concord had been operating under a millennia-old framework of diplomatic engagement, hierarchical, rigid, built on centuries of conflict and careful power balancing. Most species approached diplomatic meetings like elaborate chess matches, each delegation a collection of carefully positioned pieces ready to defend or attack. Humans had other ideas. The conference hall itself was a marvel of adaptive architecture. Walls could shift, creating intimate spaces or expansive meeting areas. Environmental conditions adjusted instantaneously to the physiological needs of different species. Translation systems had evolved beyond mere language conversion. They now captured emotional nuance, cultural context, even the subtle quantum vibrations of communication. Dr. Zixera, the Krexel representative, moved with a grace that would have been impossible months earlier. Their neural adaptive suit, a collaborative design between human and Krexel technologists, was itself a statement of possibility. Embedded with quantum communication arrays, bioresponsive adaptive materials, and a complex emotional resonance network, it represented something far beyond traditional diplomatic attire. The first session began with a protocol that would have been unthinkable in previous galactic diplomatic encounters. Instead of formal statements, instead of posturing or defensive positioning, the initial engagement was a collaborative problem-solving exercise. The challenge was presented: a complex interstellar resource dispute that had been festering for decades, threatening to erupt into widespread conflict. Most diplomatic teams would have arrived with predetermined positions, legal arguments, military contingencies. The human Krexel approach was radically different. They began by sharing stories, personal narratives, the kind of deep, vulnerable communication that most species considered a fatal weakness in diplomatic negotiations. Dr. Rice introduced a concept that would become known as empathetic diplomacy, an approach that prioritized mutual understanding over positional bargaining. The Zarkon delegation, a notoriously aggressive species known for their zero-sum approach to galactic interactions, initially viewed this as a form of weakness. Their representative, a towering crystalline being named Kraz, initially refused to participate, until something unexpected happened. One of the junior human diplomatic assistants, a young woman named Sofia Martinez, approached the Zarkon delegation during a break. Not with a formal communication device, not with a diplomatic protocol, but with a personal story about her family's struggle to survive in a challenging environment. The translation systems captured something extraordinary. It wasn't just words being exchanged. It was a fundamental sharing of experience, of emotional landscape. Krast's crystalline structure began to shift, a physical manifestation of cognitive and emotional processing that most species would have missed entirely. The Zarkon representative was not just listening. They were experiencing. By the conference's third day, the impossible was happening. The resource dispute, which had seemed insurmountable, was being reimagined as a collaborative opportunity. Species that had been on the brink of conflict were now discussing shared development, mutual growth, collective problem-solving. Dr. Rice watched the proceedings with a quiet smile. This wasn't diplomacy as it had been practiced for millennia. This was something entirely new, a form of engagement that saw conflict not as something to be won, but as an opportunity for mutual understanding. The Galactic Concord's official record would later note this conference as a turning point. not because of any specific resolution, but because of the fundamental shift in how intelligent species could interact. In the heart of this orbital complex, something profound was emerging. A new way of being. A new understanding of what connection could mean. The Quantum Evolutionary Research Station orbited a neutron star, its massive ring structure a testament to human engineering and interspecies collaboration. Here, at the very edge of known scientific understanding, humanity was rewriting the fundamental rules of biological and technological evolution. Dr. Imani Okik stood before a quantum entanglement chamber that looked more like a living artwork than a scientific instrument. Holographic displays danced around her, capturing something that defied traditional scientific observation: the moment of adaptive transformation. The project was unprecedented. Not a weapons program, not a military research initiative, but a collaborative exploration of evolutionary potential. Krexel and human researchers had discovered something extraordinary about quantum consciousness. It wasn't just a theoretical concept. It was a living, breathing mechanism of universal adaptation. The research station was designed to push the boundaries of what intelligence could mean, not just for humans or Krexel, but for all sentient life. "We're not just studying evolution," Dr. Okik explained to her team. "We're midwifing it." The central project involved creating adaptive quantum interfaces that could translate experience across biological boundaries. It was more than communication. It was a fundamental reimagining of consciousness itself. Their primary test subject was a unique hybrid system, part biological, part quantum computational matrix. Created through a collaborative process that would have been impossible mere months earlier, the system could process information in ways that made traditional computing look like an abacus. Dr. Zixera, now a full research partner, moved through the facility with a fluidity that blurred the line between biological organism and living technology. Their neural pathways had been transformed by months of collaborative research, creating something that was neither fully Krexel nor fully human. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. During a routine quantum resonance experiment, the adaptive interface began to generate patterns of consciousness that were completely unprecedented. It wasn't just processing information. It was creating new forms of understanding that transcended individual biological limitations. The research team watched in awe as the quantum matrix began to generate what could only be described as emergent consciousness, not artificial intelligence, not a simple computational system, but a living network of potential, a bridge between different forms of intelligence. "It's experiencing," Dr. Okik whispered, "not calculating. Experiencing." The implications were staggering. Traditional models of intelligence had always been limited by biological constraints: computational power, sensory input, cognitive processing speed. This was something entirely different. The quantum matrix could simultaneously exist in multiple states of understanding. It could process the emotional landscape of a Krexel survivor, the mathematical precision of a human physicist, and the environmental data from a dozen different planetary ecosystems, all while generating new forms of knowledge. Outside the research station, the neutron star pulsed with incredible energy, a metaphor for the transformative potential happening inside the facility. Humanity had always been defined by its ability to look beyond current limitations, to see potential where others saw barriers. This was that potential made manifest. The station's communication arrays began to pick up something unexpected: not a signal, not a message, but a form of communication that existed between states of being. A quantum conversation that spoke to the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Dr. Okik's team had designed the experiment to explore interspecies communication. They had expected incremental progress, careful measurements, controlled environments. Instead, they were witnessing the birth of something entirely new. The quantum matrix began to generate what could only be described as collaborative imagination. It wasn't just processing information from human and Krexel sources. It was creating new possibilities, new ways of understanding, new forms of potential that had never existed before. "We're not just observing," Dr. Zixera communicated. their quantum adaptive interface resonating with a complexity that defied traditional language. We're becoming. In the heart of this orbital research station, at the edge of a neutron star, humanity was doing what it had always done best, not conquering, not defending, but reaching, understanding, connecting. The universe watched and began to change. The Interstellar Conflict Resolution Center rose from the crystalline plains of Nexus Prime, a neutral planetary platform that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless galactic civilizations, but nothing could have prepared its ancient halls for what was about to unfold. Commander Area Santiago stood at the central projection chamber, her augmented neural interface crackling with potential energy. Around her, a holographic representation of the most complex conflict in galactic history slowly took shape, a three-dimensional tapestry of intersecting political, economic, and cultural tensions that had pushed multiple star systems to the brink of total war. This was humanity's most ambitious diplomatic challenge yet. The conflict centered on the Orion Arm, a strategic region rich with rare quantum-reactive resources. 6 different species had competing claims. Centuries of mistrust had calcified into seemingly immovable positions, and traditional mediation had failed repeatedly. The human approach was anything but traditional. Instead of legal arguments or territorial negotiations, Santiago's team had developed a radical new methodology. They called it empathetic systems analysis, an approach that treated conflicts not as zero-sum games, but as complex living ecosystems of interconnected experiences. Their first step was unprecedented. Rather than bringing diplomatic representatives, they invited the actual communities affected by the conflict. Not leaders, not politicians, but farmers, traders, scientists, artists, the people whose lives were directly impacted by the potential war. The holographic chamber transformed. No longer a sterile diplomatic space, it became a living representation of interconnected experiences. Personal stories began to overlay the complex geopolitical data. A Vorlani agricultural worker's struggle to maintain her family's farm. A Zarkon mining engineer's dreams of sustainable resource development. A Krexel ecological researcher's vision of interspecies environmental restoration. Dr. Sixera, now a key member of the human diplomatic corps, moved through the projection like a living bridge between worlds. Their quantum adaptive communication interface translated more than words. It captured emotional resonance, cultural context, unspoken hopes and fears. The traditional approach would have been to find a compromise, to divide resources, to create buffer zones, to establish complex legal frameworks that would inevitably lead to future conflicts. Humanity offered something entirely different, a complete reimagining of the problem. The team began by creating what they called a collective future simulation. Not a simple predictive model, but a living, adaptive scenario that allowed each affected community to see their potential futures, not just as separate entities, but as an interconnected ecosystem. Trade routes became shared development projects. Competing resource claims transformed into collaborative ecological restoration initiatives. Military defense budgets were reimagined as joint scientific research programs. Commander Santiago watched as centuries of mistrust began to dissolve. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about compromise. It was about creating a future that was genuinely better for everyone involved. The Vorlani representative, a being composed of intricate biocrystalline structures, began to vibrate with an emotion that had no direct translation. Something between understanding, hope, and a fundamental shift in perception. "We have been looking at this all wrong," the representative communicated. The translation systems captured not just the words, but the profound emotional landscape behind them. By the 3rd day, something extraordinary happened. The conflict that had seemed insurmountable began to dissolve, not through traditional diplomacy, not through force or compromise, but through a fundamental reimagining of what was possible. The holographic chamber became a living blueprint of collaborative potential. Resource extraction sites transformed into shared ecological research centers. Military installations became joint scientific platforms. Cultural exchange programs emerged where defense treaties once stood. Dr. Zixera's final communication captured the essence of what was happening. We are not solving a conflict. We are creating a future. As the simulation concluded, the representatives from 6 different species stood together, not as competitors, not as potential enemies, but as collaborative partners in a shared journey of survival and growth. The ancient halls of the Interstellar Conflict Resolution Center had witnessed many moments, but nothing like this. Humanity had done what no species had managed before. They hadn't just resolved a conflict. They had shown the galaxy a new way of being. The Interstellar Cultural Archive existed in a state between physical reality and quantum memory. Located on a mobile planetary complex that drifted through the most stable regions of the galactic core, it was humanity's most ambitious preservation project. A living museum of collective experience that defied traditional understanding of history, culture, and consciousness. Dr. Kai Chen stood before the Empathy Resonance Chamber, a vast crystalline structure that captured the collective memories of multiple species. Unlike traditional archival methods, this was not about preserving static information. It was about maintaining living, breathing cultural narratives. The first generation of human Krexel collaborative children had just reached adulthood. They were something entirely unprecedented, beings who existed between species, cultures, and ways of understanding the universe. Zara Rodriguez Zix, the eldest of this new generation, moved through the archive with a fluidity that spoke to her unique heritage. Her neural pathways were a complex quantum network that could simultaneously process information from multiple biological and cultural perspectives. She was neither human nor Krexel, but something entirely new. Memory is not a record, she often said. It's a living conversation. The Interstellar Cultural Archive had become more than a preservation site. It was a living laboratory of cultural evolution. Each exhibit was an interactive experience that allowed visitors to not just observe, but truly experience the collective memories of different species. A Zarkon diplomat walked through a memory reconstruction of early human space exploration. Instead of a clinical historical display, they experienced the emotional landscape of the first lunar landing. The fear, the hope, the incredible human capacity for wonder. The archive's most controversial project was the Collective Consciousness Initiative. It wasn't about erasing individual identities. It was about creating a space where different species could genuinely understand each other's experiences at the deepest possible level. Dr. Chen watched as Zara worked on her latest project, a quantum memory weave that could translate complex emotional experiences across species boundaries. It was more than translation. It was a fundamental reimagining of communication. We're not just sharing information, Zara explained. We're creating a living bridge of understanding. The generational shift was profound. Where previous galactic civilizations had been defined by conflict, competition, and territorial expansion, this new generation saw the universe as a collaborative ecosystem. They didn't just tolerate differences, they celebrated them. The archive's most powerful exhibit was a constantly evolving installation called Becoming. It tracked the moment of transformation, how different species had moved from conflict to understanding, not as a linear narrative, but as a living, breathing quantum experience that visitors could literally step into. Zara's work focused on what she called empathetic quantum mapping, a method of capturing not just the factual history of different species, but the emotional landscape that shaped their evolution. Each memory was a complex, multi-dimensional experience that could be explored from multiple perspectives. The Krexel survivors who had first arrived on Earth were now cultural ambassadors, helping to create these immersive experiences. What had begun as a crash landing had transformed into the most profound cultural exchange in galactic history. A Vorlani researcher stepped into a memory reconstruction of a human community responding to a natural disaster. It wasn't just about observing heroic actions. The experience allowed direct emotional resonance, feeling the fear, the hope, the incredible human capacity for collective support. The archive was rewriting the fundamental understanding of cultural preservation. This wasn't about maintaining static records. It was about keeping cultural experiences alive, vibrant, and actively transformative. Zara's latest project threatened to push boundaries even further. She was developing a quantum memory weave that could allow direct emotional experience across not just different species, but potentially different forms of consciousness. Imagine, she told her research team, being able to truly understand another being's entire lived experience. Not through words, not through clinical observation, but through direct, visceral connection. As the day concluded, Dr. Chen watched the sunset through the archive's quantum adaptive windows. The landscape shifted, reflecting not just the physical environment, but the emotional landscape of those observing it. This was more than a cultural archive. This was the living proof of what humanity had always believed, that true understanding was the most powerful force in the universe. The Nexus Convergence represented humanity's most ambitious project, a massive stellar engineering initiative that was simultaneously a scientific endeavor, a diplomatic mission, and a philosophical statement about the nature of existence. Constructed at the intersection of multiple galactic spiral arms, the Nexus was more than a space station. It was a living testament to what collaborative intelligence could achieve. Massive quantum adaptive structural modules shifted and reconfigured, creating spaces that could simultaneously accommodate the physiological needs of dozens of different species. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood at the central observation deck, watching as delegations from across known space prepared for the most significant gathering in galactic history. This was more than a conference. This was a fundamental reimagining of collective potential. The project had begun with a simple, almost audacious concept. What if the greatest threat to intelligent life wasn't external conflict, but the inability to truly understand one another? Quantum communication arrays hummed with potential. Each delegation brought not just representatives, but living archives of their species' collective experience. The Krexel quantum memory networks intertwined with human empathetic mapping technologies. Zarkam computational matrices merged with Vorlani ecological modeling systems. Dr. Zixera, now a senior coordinator of interspecies collaboration, moved through the complex with a grace that defied traditional understanding of movement or communication. Their quantum adaptive interface pulsed with a complexity that was simultaneously a language, a computational system, and a form of emotional expression. The Nexus Convergence had multiple objectives, but its primary purpose was nothing less than charting a collective path for intelligent life in the universe. The first day focused on comprehensive ecological restoration, not just of individual planets, but of entire stellar ecosystems. Species that had once competed for resources now collaborated on projects that would take centuries to complete. Terraforming initiatives, stellar engineering projects, and quantum adaptive ecological modeling created blueprints for collaborative survival. Zara Rodriguez Zix led a presentation that left even the most cynical delegate speechless. Her quantum memory weave demonstrated how different species could not just communicate, but fundamentally share experience. A Zarkon mining engineer could directly experience the emotional landscape of a Vorlani agricultural worker. A Krexel military strategist could feel the hopes and fears of a human environmental researcher. We are not just sharing information, Zara explained. We are creating a living network of collective understanding. The second day explored technological development. But this was unlike any technological conference in galactic history. Instead of competitive presentations, it was a collaborative design session. Species shared not just technological innovations, but the fundamental thought processes that led to those innovations. A breakthrough came unexpectedly. A joint research team developed a quantum communication network that could translate not just language, but emotional and experiential nuance across species boundaries. It wasn't just a communication tool. It was a fundamental bridge of understanding. The final day addressed the most challenging topic: collective survival and expansion. Traditional galactic civilizations had always approached space exploration as a competitive endeavor. Colonization, resource extraction, territorial expansion. Humanity offered a different perspective. The proposed initiative was nothing less than a collaborative exploration of the universe, not as conquerors, not as competitors, but as a collective intelligence seeking to understand the fundamental nature of existence. Dr. Rodriguez's closing statement captured the essence of this new approach. We are not just exploring the universe. We are creating a living, breathing network of collective intelligence. As the conference concluded, something extraordinary happened. The quantum communication arrays began to generate something unprecedented. A collective consciousness that transcended individual species. Not a hive mind, not a loss of individual identity, but a living network of shared understanding. The nexus itself seemed to pulse with potential. Structural modules reconfigured, creating spaces that were simultaneously physical and quantum. Communication systems merged and separated in complex, beautiful patterns. Outside, the stars themselves seemed to watch. Humanity had done something that no species had managed before. They hadn't conquered the universe. They hadn't dominated other species. They had shown that the most powerful force in existence was the capacity to truly understand one another. As the delegations prepared to return to their home systems, something had fundamentally changed. This was more than a diplomatic conference. This was the beginning of something entirely new.